Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks and welcome to our session today. We appreciate you being with us and apologize for not being there in person. I'm Roger Strong, Vice President of Academic Sales at Gale. Unfortunately, due to some prior conflicts, we are coming to you virtually, but we do have some help from, I know Leah and Ben in the room there. So we did want to share with you today. The topic of our conversation is cross-institutional partnerships for equity, diversity, inclusion. And we have the benefit of having three folks join us on a pre-recorded session, which we'll share for the next 35 to 40 minutes or so. And then we'll open it up to questions and comments. So we encourage you to sit back and enjoy the lively discussion, which is a great one. And then we do also encourage you for the chat, as well as we'll open it up to Q&A in the ballroom post discussion. So with that, let me share my screen and we will get going.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsey Gervais, Digital Learning Manager at Gale, and welcome to our session, Cultivating Cross-Institutional Partnerships for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Access to resources that move towards more inclusive research and learning environments is certainly an evolving and increasingly critical initiative on the top of the strategic minds in higher education. Today, we are joined by two academic library professionals who will share their experiences in elevating equity, diversity, inclusion programming at the consortia and university levels. With all that aside, let's get started. Anne and Lisa, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. So I'm Anne Osterman. I've been with Viva since 2012 and the director since 2015. Viva is Virginia's academic library consortium. We have 71 members, from large public doctorals to all of the 2 years in the state, as well as a lot of private schools, including specialized law and medical schools. So my work with Viva is basically to negotiate pricing and terms for Viva's collections contracts. I also do a lot of work organizing cost shares for shared resources, and I kind of shepherd products through that committee path.
Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Davis. I am the interim director of the Florida International University College of Law Library in Miami, Florida. I also am the assistant director for digital initiatives, which covers electronic resource management and access to our electronic resources. For those of you who don't know, Florida International University is a large public institution in South Florida, and we have bachelor's, master's, PhD, and myriad programs to serve the South Florida community.
It's such a privilege to be able to speak with you both today. And let's jump right in. I'd like to know how equity, diversity, inclusion has been defined and evolved within your roles within the past 1 to 2 years. Anne, do you want to get us started?
Sure. So historically, equity for Viva has mostly been framed as leveling the academic playing field. We have a core collection for our public institutions that's pretty, ebooks, databases, streaming media, journals that's held in common. And we have a large resource sharing program. So that has been sort of the foundation of who we are. And I think it can be seen as a form of equity. Diversity, or at least what I would say bibliodiversity, was a focus of projects like our monographic collection analysis in the past. In general, we want to use our resources wisely to enable the very widest range of materials available statewide. In the past couple years, there's been a new burst of activity. Our steering committee had an anti-racism statement in 2020. They wanted to be sure that there were actions associated as well, not just words. So that's another piece that has been really important to Viva. And that has spawned many new initiatives. We have an anti-racism webinar series. We have a protected space group for BIPOC colleagues to come together in a safe and private conversation. We have a textbook affordability survey that's focused on educational equity, and it just kind of goes on and on for us. In some ways, I think this is a really nice broadened framing of leveling the playing field, focusing on EDI, but it also has some really specific goals connected. So it's sort of larger and more focused at the same time. And I think another piece for us is that it has become really important that we see all of our jobs focused on this. There's not just one that's going to solve the problem for us. It really takes all of us working together.
So similarly, this is a group project, and issues of diversity, equity, inclusion have been part of the strategic plan and methodology at FIU for many years, incorporating into every aspect of learning and employment at the university. A couple years ago, the focus regarding equity specifically was on Affordability Counts initiatives, which is a Florida state-based initiative to ensure that students are given affordable course materials. And for the College of Law, I was keen to participate in those activities because, as you can imagine, in law school, those materials can be quite expensive, and how the law library can work with the institution to ensure that that equity was fulfilled. But more recently, and especially after the social justice movement of 2020, this has expanded and has become a challenge almost for everyone to participate in the research aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion. And that has a different flavor and a different effect. And how do we go about ensuring that library resources reflect the research that is being done by the students, staff, and faculty of the university? So that's kind of how it's evolved over the past couple of years. And the first focus hasn't gone away, but now we have new things to talk about and consider.
Well, with all of that said, let's talk about the objectives for your organizations that sort of refine a strategic plan for EDI within your roles and others. Lisa, could you tell us a little bit about EDI as a strategic initiative at FIU, and how did you step in as part of that strategic plan, and who were the other key players as part of that plan?
Sure. So last year, we were keen to build on expanding our EDI resources for our patrons. We had purchased some content that covered the ACLU, but still had, coverage difficulties with the civil rights movements of the 1960s and other historical eras, and also looking more into the modern era in the past 10 or 20 years. And it was just a kind of a murmuring and a conversation. And looking across campus, I had served on the Chosen First Name Policy Implementation Team, because FIU has now given everyone the ability to choose their first name and preferred pronouns as a result of that initiative. And through those opportunities, it became clear to me that this was important, and this is something that was a strategic focus for the university. Additionally, last year at the same time, almost simultaneously, we had the social justice movement from 2020 and from the tragic events over the summer of that year. And the American Bar Association had called out to legal educators to come together and to address these issues. And there's many different versions of this. And it just became something that I reached out to my colleagues across campus and kind of started having those conversations about how can we answer the call of these different strategic moments from these different national, but also local to the university concerns.
Great. And Anne, as someone who has a higher foot view of higher education from the consortia perspective, when it comes to curation and allocation of library resources for EDI, what were some of the objectives you hope to achieve, and who else sat at the table for this planning?
Sure. So we're always interested in identifying the best use of shared funds to build that core collection for higher education in Virginia. And that includes providing research and teaching resources for EDI in a direct sense, as well as helping to ensure that content produced through our own Viva Open Grants program has a focus on marginalized communities and inclusiveness. And so one of the ways we've approached this is actually through adding EDI components and values to our existing collections renewal tool, which is the value metric tool. It has a wide variety of criteria. There's relevance to Virginia degree programs, there's sort of cost per use and usage by institution types, the sort of more normal or standard ones that come together. And it has, I won't get into the value metric tool, but it has kind of this total possible 100 points. That's how it makes it even across resources. And so we've been working over the past year or so to add EDI components. Helen McManus and Christopher Lauder from George Mason, Summer Durant from University of Mary Washington, and Jenya O'Gara from the Viva office, they have been the kind of core working group to this. And they've done a lot of thinking about how to add it to in a really holistic way. So they've added, for example, kind of 3 areas. One is EDI content. That might be, does this collection contribute to making our collections more representative? Does it have historically oppressed voices? Another would be EDI engagement. Is there a demonstrable commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion from that given publisher or vendor? And that's not looking for a statement, but actual concrete actions. And then the third there would be EDI accessibility. That would be really format specific questions. Are there audio descriptions? Are there transcripts? Are those very needed pieces for users? So in addition to that working group, you said kind of who are we working with? We met with publishers and vendors to get a sense of the importance of those metrics, and they learn from them as well, how they're engaging with EDI work and what sort of metrics they are looking at. We met with accessibility experts across Virginia to understand the best way to evaluate resources. That include a very deliberate framing of high expectations. A VPAT or a minimum level is not enough to get any points, for example, in the tool. And then we also met with George Mason University EDI group about teaching and learning, and they were really helpful as making sure what we're doing is actually usable and applicable. So we also had over the summer kind of a very large meeting for anyone in the consortium to come have a view. So that's been a piece of it, but I'll also say that that is about renewals and maybe eventually making space for new content when we identify gaps. But we've also been lucky enough to acquire significant additions to our shared collections in support of EDI. This was largely possible through funding from the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. We got a grant from the Fund for Excellence in Innovation, and this was to purchase EDI content. It was based on a really extensive committee review of many options, but a special focus on perpetual access one-time purchases because it was a grant. The committee wanted really to include primary sources and current analysis, and I think that's one of those framings that's been really important, is you want both the history and you want up-to-date looks at that. And in the end, we purchased Gale's Indigenous Peoples of North America. We have a custom collection of Gale EDI relevant ebooks and 2 large collections from Redex. One was African Americans and Jim Crow, and the other is African Americans and Reconstruction. And so that has been a really important expansion. And I think it combines that the EDI focus of leveling the playing field with just literally everyone in the public schools has access. And then one last one, it was more of it's a continuing cost. It's not quite the same, but we were lucky enough to be able to get History Makers, which is the largest African-American video oral history collection. So it's been sort of a combination of opportunity. If you see it that way, these are the funds we have, that's how we can apply them, and also building a framework that we can lean on when we're looking at all of our existing renewals.
Yeah, and just to take a little bit of a dive deeper into what you've said, Anne, how do you think these partnerships that you've started differ from what you were doing before in order to sort of meet the moment in EDI?
Well, the conversations with the publishers have been really valuable just in themselves. I think we're always learning something, and I think we're also always sharing something in those conversations. It emphasizes our goals. I think that's one way that you can put it, but it also always brings something to light. For example, we really see accessibility as foundational to EDI, and we had a publisher who hadn't seen it that way, and so that was an interesting inroad. We also were talking about reparative metadata with another vendor, and that was something that they hadn't thought of. And so I think that has strengthened the back and forth and then doing better together. We're hoping to learn as well. It's, we have our own authors in our Viva Open Grant program. We want to be sure we're doing the right thing with our authors in our program. And so we can learn from publishers what they are trying to track. And that's a really new and growing area. How can we do that in the best way? And so I think we can all do this better together is the hope.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Lisa, I know that you have had a similar story about regarding Better Together, right? Would you be able to describe the reasons why you took action around curating diverse collections when it comes to your faculty, and what were sort of the pain points that you experienced?
Absolutely. So there were 3 guiding events that came together that, as Anne was saying, we can do better together. Last year, my law librarian colleagues across the nation were charged with creating guides online to help their institutions, and all of these guides are open access. So we were charged with creating these online guides that would show people what is going on in the law behind social justice and police practices and all of those relevant issues. At FIU Law, we eventually created what is now the Advancing Racial Justice Guide at FIU. At the same time, the American Bar Association established the Legal Education Police Practices Consortium. And this was, I believe, last fall. This was fall of 2020. And FIU Law is also a founding member of that consortium. Since then, librarians are now tasked with making sure that the work of that consortium is reflected in resources and the provision of information to the faculty and researchers at our institution in order to effectuate the work of that consortium. And the third thing that came together was FIU's Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion had published a Equity Action Initiative proposal last fall as well, which talked about everything running the gamut at FIU in terms of education and employment, and how we were going to go about tackling these issues and addressing these concerns. So in the course of doing all these things and participating and drafting the guide and working with my institutional stakeholders, it became clear that we needed to really take a hard look at our collections and kind of determine where we were missing things and what was missing and how we could satisfy the needs of the researchers. And actually, the director of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I met with her and I was compelled by her story, Dr. Emmanuel Bowles. She had experienced this very challenge where she was doing research, and she's the director of DEI at FIU, and couldn't access materials, was clicking on a link and nothing was coming back in full text. And that spoke to me, and that told the story of how the changing nature of the research in this area in EDI was necessitating expanding our collections and looking for different ways that we could support the researchers at FIU and provide them with the access they needed to do the important work that they were engaging in. And that was also important for the law school as well, because as I mentioned, we had little by little been trying to build our collection and achieve having a full collection of resources. And these things typically take time, but when you have this opportunity and these compelling stories and all these different national organizations saying now is the time to act and do something, that we came together and we started working on this.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And when Anne mentioned a lot of the ways that she expanded her collections and some of the vendors and organizations she paired with. Tell us a little bit about your grant and what partnerships across your institution and with vendors did you have to make in order to reach these EDI objectives and alleviate some of these pain points?
Sure. So every every fiscal year, there is a grant opportunity in the state of Florida to engage in writing a grant to see if you can get those primary resources, those one-time only cost resources, in order to be able to fund things that typically do cost a lot of money, but are very important primary resources. So the FIU Law Library is a partner with the FIU libraries of the larger university institution, and we work on these grants typically every year just as part of our routine, if you will. So last year we came together and said, let's see what's out there. Let's see where we can expand in EDI subject matter. I had already been engaging in conversations with our Gale representative in order to see how we could expand upon those ACLU and those civil rights collections. And I was looking into, for the law library, trying to purchase a subset of the Archives Unbound collection. And with all of these other things that were happening at the same time last fall, I was working with my colleagues at FIU Libraries, and they were interested in other parts of the EDI collection as well. So we got together and you said, listen, let's see who we can talk to on campus and see where the research is. And that's how I came into contact with the director at FIU of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Division. So we drafted a proposal and we were all thinking, this isn't going to fly. This is way too much money. They're never going to fund this. But with that compelling story, with other stakeholders at FIU that I had worked with through the Chosen First Name and Pronouns Task Force, with my own dean of the College of Law, with the support of other deans of Florida International University, we drafted this proposal, this grant proposal, with the support of Gale representatives as well, to kind of show where FIU was missing content in comparison with other benchmark institutions. And we wrote this compelling story. And you know what? It worked. It got funded. And I think that's the goal here, is to try and figure out different unique ways, reach across the aisle. We talked to so many different colleagues to try and craft this compelling story. And here we are. And now we have a full collection of these resources. And I know they're being used because Emmanuel reached out and she said, this is great. I was able to find the things that I was looking for. So it was a really nice story last year.
That sounds incredible. You know, it's amazing how much change the both of you are able to facilitate by collaborating with so many different stakeholders, so many different experts who could really refine the things that you were looking for, and then how you were going to get the money and the access to these resources, right? Because, you know, oftentimes we're also seeing in COVID times that libraries are having a hard time finding the resources that they need. So it's such a compelling story. You know, speaking of compelling, in my conversations with you prior, and you said it so eloquently, that, you know, you look to move towards collections that are about and by marginalized communities. So when it comes to developing a program around collections and meeting the needs for so many different types of institutions, you know, in consortia, what piece of advice would you give to librarians and higher education leaders to overcome some of the challenges and obstacles that we were just talking about?
Yeah, and you highlight one that's really important to us and really difficult. So I think what I would say, you know, is I am not an expert here. So look for the experts and listen to them. that the adjustment to our value metric tool that I was talking about, that really it grew out of member institutions being interested in improving it and putting time in. It came out of accessibility experts throughout the state really advising us on the process. And so for these higher education leaders, I would say find the experts and then give them the actual time to do this. It's a lot of work to do it well. And it's too often people are asked to do this as kind of an extra thing on top of all the other stuff they're doing. If you give them the real time to commit to it, you really benefit. You can, if you have all these really talented collection development officers and librarians and liaisons and give them the real time to set aside and focus, everyone's collections will really improve in very deep ways. And I would say there's so many facets to it as well. I mean, I think you mentioned there are the marginalized voices in communities that are content by them. There's also, even into open access, not all those models are equitable, right? That's a whole other area we could talk about that we'll get to today, I'm sure, but that's another one. Can students actually see themselves in the product, right? Can you find diverse content? And that's in reviewing during the spring, we did all of those reviews. We actually gave a lot of, I think, helpful feedback to publishers and vendors saying, what we wanted to see was this, right? We want to see, when we say current, if we're talking about ebooks, maybe stuff from the 80s isn't so helpful if it's analysis. Yep. Maybe we want to give users more current content. Can we find ways to have harmful content weeded out? We actually sent back, I have these great librarians at the committee that would highlight titles that might have actually been harmful. So we would tell the publisher, hey, this actually might be a harmful title or some kind of harmful content. So it's that really focused investment, I think, that makes a difference.
What about you, Lisa? Thank you, Anne.
I think the message that I want to give to my fellow librarian colleagues is keep trying. Think of different ways to achieve your goal and have that goal clear in your mind when you go and try to achieve what you're trying to achieve, right? You don't want to get off that path. I agree with Anne, work with publishers, talk to them about what your institutional needs are, because we're all very different, right? We're all very diverse and we all have different focuses that we want to achieve for our collections, especially in collection development, because our researcher base is going to be unique and different. This is very true in South Florida. We focus on international law at the law school. That is unique in the country for our law school, and it's something that I have to consider in collection development concerns. The other thing is persistence. With anything where you have to get outside funding, and we all can commiserate about funding and how to go about doing these things, try again, try a different way. Think about different ways that you can fund things and get what you need in a way that makes sense for your institution. This grant process is unique in the state of Florida, but it's not a unique thing for libraries to seek grants in order to get the work done. I can say that this grant process last year, we started in November and we submitted the grant in March. So time is also something that needs to be given, like Anne was saying, to these initiatives. You need to give yourself time and a little bit of grace in terms of not everything happens overnight, but also be watchful and mindful of those opportunities. So, that's what I can offer, is just, if you have that goal in mind and you keep it in your mind and it's clear in your mind, you'll find the path to follow. I hope that makes sense. It's just,
it totally does. And
yeah.
Actually, Lisa, you just covered a follow-up question that I was going to ask around timing. You sort of said that, there was a time you had to get it done for the grant, right?
Yes.
How much time did it take you to be able to sort of nurture and collaborate with your partners on this? And then, but also, how do you balance the time that you need to take, right, with meeting the moment, right, in order to meet the needs in an efficient manner? So I think, Lisa, you answered that question, but I have that question for Anne. What did your timing look like with this initiative?
Yeah, sometimes I would say it became a very fast selection process by our standards. Deciding anything as a group is a whole process, because there's the professional advice, there's the committees, there's the actual steering committee that would actually make the final decisions. There was a lot of weeding through. There was a lot of good options out there, right? So it's sifting through all that to what makes the most sense in our case for our schools as a whole is not an easy question to answer. So I would say, I think we had final selections in a couple of months, which sounds like a long time, but it really isn't for us. And so I think in that way, we're trying to turn success into success with this, with this grant. We were able to show what we could buy for Virginia. And so I've, as part of my request to the state going forward, is standing money for this. Can we have this in a way to build EDI collections for Virginia each year with our program? And so with that, I'm starting to develop kind of my back pocket options, right? So they have them more at hand. I had some kind of at hand, but having more of them ahead of time, so that when opportunities pop up, we can react a little more nimbly if we have to. Sometimes it might be even foundation funds, who knows? It can come from anywhere. But yeah, for us, it's one of those things where we can't make we can make no decision quickly, but that's about the fastest we can do.
I don't think that's too far away from the trends overall. Both of you talked about this sort of desire to work reciprocally with vendors. If you were to, around EDI, what's one, I want to say, like, wish list or thing to keep vendors to keep in mind when it comes to EDI and the needs of your institutions or consortia? What's that one thing that you would wave your magic wand for?
I can only pick one. Oh. I think for me, if I could wave my magic wand, it would be to have current collections. There are, in creating the guide, and this was focused on the law, right? So there is so much content, and there are so many people, and there are so many professionals and educators and researchers and politicians, and it goes on, creating content and the internet. How are you going to even go about indexing that, much less providing full text access to the underlying resource? And I think that is, if I could have anything for the publishers to provide, is some way to, at the very least, index what's going on. And I realize that's probably an insurmountable challenge, but I also think it might be more attainable. It might be easier to do if you focused it on local based research and resources. You are hearing today from two people that have live in different states and serve different populations and patrons and communities. And we have different interests, going down to the local level. And I think that's what's going to be missing going forward, because it's a different task to keep up with the present than to index the past. So that would be my magic wand. But a more practical one, if everything could just be accessible for everybody and meet accessibility standards, let's do that. That's a little bit easier, but that would make my life easier as well. If all my content was automatically accessible for everyone, that would be perfect.
I totally agree with Lisa on all those points. I think there's a discovery. There's a lot of things that get in the way of what should be streamlined and unified as in discovery as possible. That just is the amount of time that we spend in knowledge-based collections and other things trying to get everything to get along. Vendors could make that easier, is what I'll say. And also that there's that added appeal of curation and having publishers have people actually, how about hire some people from marginalized communities and historically oppressed places and giving them the power to make the changes that are right and have that curation ability to highlight those things that are really meaningful. And I can't resist the accessibility piece as well. There's the Library Accessibility Alliance is doing a great work. And even then it's just, that's one of those great examples of work done at scale that benefits all of us. But even there, it could use, and they know this too, if they were, they have these really dense readings, right? Can you, as Lisa said, can you get it to those simple, can we just make it these ways to get better and just wave our magic wands? That I'd be so tempted as well.
Hey, I asked and you delivered for sure. Last question, is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything else you'd like our Charleston session conference attendees to know?
Well, we have one that didn't really come up here, Viva, but it's one we're really excited about. We have a support for small publishers task force that relates to a lot of these topics. In addition to we want to support sustainability for small publishers. We want to get them more of the money back. Sometimes aggregators can eat through some of that. And so that's been important. And it has a special focus on minority owned and led publishers as well. And so that's one that we have an eye on. And actually the History Makers collection that I mentioned before, that grew out of that task force. That is a small publisher in that way. And so I think that's something that, consolidation is a real risk to voices sometimes, not all times, but voices. And part of that is also building infrastructure. And so if all libraries can try to find ways to get the money where it helps the people that want to be heard and should be heard, then I think that's one of the goals of that task force.
I think building off of that, the librarian knows their patrons, knows their researchers, and knows what's going on in their community. Write those guides. Don't wait for it to be perfect. Don't wait for the perfect opportunity to show up. Do the work day in, day out, and those things will come to you. If I could ask for anything, it would be for us to all as a community draft those guides, get that information out, and make it available for people to read and interact with and support what's going on locally in your community, because that's what's going to get lost in the bigger picture, and those stories are very compelling and very important to this larger EDI puzzle.
That's just a beautiful way to put the frosting on the cake, right? EDI really is a community-based effort, and that's really the mission behind all of our work, right? Ladies, thank you so much for chatting with me today. This has been so wonderful.
So I want to thank Lindsey and Anne and Lisa for a wonderful conversation around collaborative collection building. I thought it was a lot of interesting things came to mind as I've sat in on conversations and sessions this week at Charleston virtually. I think there are a lot of those similar themes going on around accessibility and DEI, which I think Anne and Lisa had mentioned. So we have about 20 minutes left, and what we did want to do is take questions, both in the chat and live in the ballroom. And while we're waiting for those questions to develop, we do have, early on in the session, we did post a mentee survey. So I'm going to share my screen and encourage you all, if you haven't done already, whether it's on your mobile device in the ballroom or online, we have our first of 2 questions posted. So let me just share my screen here, and we can see where we were at so far. So the first question: how important is EDI collection building or delivery at your library organization? So right now, it's interesting, no top priorities yet, but very important or not important. So be curious if you could take some time. We'd love to get a pulse of the room of off of the discussion. How important is that? Whether you're a vendor publisher or you're a library, what are your thoughts there? So we'll give it a minute. Right now, I'm just looking in the chat. So I don't see any questions as of yet. And I'll refer to Ben in the ballroom. Are there any questions there yet that we have from the participants in the ballroom? Okay, we'll give it another minute or so here. So the other thing I want to encourage you to do, unfortunately, Anne and Lisa couldn't join us today, but I encourage you to reach out to them directly. And of course, we're happy to filter any comments or interest in talking with them more about their efforts around DEI collection building. The other important elements, and we've enjoyed working with them into supporting their DEI collection building efforts. I know we posted in the chat some of those things that Gale has put together, the Gale Pages Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Bundles, which help support some of those grant writing activities that go on. And that is one of the things that I think we found, particularly, I think Lisa mentioned it with FIU, is the ability to understand where peer institutions are sitting in relation to your particular library when it comes to DEI holdings. And that's a pretty important case to be built to see that grant go through in her case. So why don't we're going to move to the next question. So right now it looks like we're very important and not important. Let me just go to the next question here. So if you could also log into Menti, use the code there. What are some ways your library organization has explored strengthening DEI collection building? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the ways, maybe very similar to what Lindsey discussed with Anne and Lisa around DEI collection building, or maybe there are different types of things that you're looking at. Okay, so we see webinars, community. I think community, we talked about, academic libraries as service to community, which I think is very important, right, for those local populations and helping to serve those. Webinars, obviously, very important in this day and age with our virtual outreach efforts. Anything else out there? Again, community is front and center. Would love to hear if any of you have had success with outside the library funding or grant writing, if any of that has helped in your DEI collection building efforts. Mandatory DEI training, a very good one, right? And I think if we think about things like the ALA scorecard that was recently, I think, released in July of this year, around those, how library organizations are stacking up to that library scorecard model, right, for information organizations or even as publishers. Diversity councils, another great one. Great, so budget allocation, right, which I think is often can be a challenge, I know, but again, an important piece to focus on. And we will be sure to save these and share these out as files as part of the session documents post, so that folks can take a look at the polling results. Talk to DEI faculty, great. Do we have anyone in the ballroom or even on Zoom that would like to share some of their efforts around diversity, equity, inclusion, collection voting efforts that maybe are similar or different from what Anne and Lisa were sharing? Okay, nothing from the ballroom. All right. Well, with that, if we don't have any other questions, we do want to encourage you again, if you have not already, Gale is offering free access to Digital Scholar Lab as part of our contest at Charleston. So we'd ask you, there was a link earlier posted in the chat, and we will share it out online as well. So you can go to our virtual booth website to sign up at the Charleston conference, and you can take part there. And also, we'd be happy to answer any questions post-session that you may have around diversity, equity, inclusion, grant funding efforts, and those sorts of things. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us today, and wish you all the best in a very successful Charleston. We hope to be with you in person there next year. Thanks so much.